Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Richard Shyness. I'm the Best Family Dean of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and we're very pleased to have you join us for the final webinar in our Dietrich Deep Dive series. Today's on voter suppression and voter fraud, featuring Kareem Haggag and Lisa Tetrault. So as I've mentioned previously, the idea for the deep dives originated really over the fall and early in the new year. There were so many issues coming out surrounding the election: voting security, the spread of misinformation, concerns about voter suppression, etc. And for many of these issues, the information we would get from newspapers or TV was very frustratingly shallow. So we thought it would be a good idea to gather experts to speak about these issues. And it turns out that we have dozens of experts among the CMU faculty. So we've already covered electronic voting security, social media and misinformation, cable news and political tribalism, and the psychology of conspiracy theories. And today we'll cover voter suppression and voter fraud. And I should mention that we nailed down this topic before all the recent drama with new voting laws being passed in Georgia, Florida, and Texas. So hosting and moderating today's session is Kareem Haggag, an assistant professor in our Social and Decision Sciences department. Kareem studies topics at the intersection of economics and psychology, and including racial disparities in voting wait times and the effect of early life experiences on voter participation and partisan identity. Kareem, take it away.
Thank you, Richard. So today I'm honored to introduce Professor Lisa Tetrault, an associate professor of history here at CMU in the Dietrich College. Lisa specializes in the history of gender, race, and American democracy, with a focus on social movements and political memory. She is a leading scholar of women's suffrage, and her work has been recognized and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian Institution, among many others. Lisa is a committed public historian, and she has lectured and advised on various projects related to US suffrage, broadly construed. To give just a few examples that you can go out, and I would encourage you to go out and watch, she has served as a historical consultant on the documentary The Vote, which recently aired on PBS. And you can also find her making appearances in a couple of recent documentaries. So you can find her telling the story of women's voting in the HBO documentary Soul of America. And you can also find her in a new Netflix docuseries by Will Smith titled Amend, which is about the 14th Amendment. Among all of these other roles and honors, Lisa is also an award-winning teacher. This past fall, she co-taught a Grand Challenge seminar for first-year students on the timely and relevant to today's discussion topic of how we vote. Lisa's work dispels common misunderstandings related to the long history of the fight for voter access in the US. Her work also unites histories that are often constructed many years after events and presented in ways that are unnaturally segregated. For example, her prize-winning book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, Memory and the Women's Suffrage Movement, 1848 to 1898, highlights the way in which this mythology of the movement's origin was constructed and popularized many years later in response to the racial politics of the Civil War, after the Civil War, the racial politics of memory after the Civil War. Her scholarship shows how these mythologies limit our understanding of a complex and diverse movement for voting rights that remains unfinished and ongoing. She is also currently working on a number of articles, including work on the 19th Amendment, as well as an also never before done genealogy of the language. And she is also working on a book titled What Right to Vote? An Unexpected History of American Democracy, 1776 to 2026. Today, I'm looking forward to hearing Lisa present and lead a somber discussion about US voter enfranchisement and disenfranchisement and suppression, including some of the very real and pressing challenges we are facing today. So my role is I'm going to moderate the Q&A. After Lisa presents, we'll have a discussion, including questions that you can submit over the Q&A feature. I'll be collecting those, so be sure to submit them as the talk goes on. And we'll be taking some of those as well as some pre-submitted questions for discussion at the end. So with that, I will pass it off to Lisa.
Oops. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be with you. Thank you to the Dean for hosting such an important discussion so that we can all, as citizens, continue to educate ourselves about the democracy that relies on all of us, and also for bringing in all the interesting work that so many scholars here at Carnegie Mellon are doing. I've spent the last 2 years on the public lecture circuit and have really enjoyed having public discussions about this topic. So I'm looking forward to today. And indeed, we scheduled this before the current spate of state election law. And given that that's all going on, and given how massive this topic is becoming and has become over the last many years, rather than try to cover everything that's going on, my aim today is to give you a spine of how US history and US law has evolved around voting, so that you can think about where to hang each of the different pieces that are coming up in the news, because they are all part of one long story of American democracy, and they're all pieces of the same thing, rather than thinking of them as a million discrete parts. So my goal today is to give you a kind of interpretive apparatus to apply to the world that we're living in right now. And in that will come a whole variety of different pieces of information, and hopefully it'll all fit in together into a story that you can then apply to what's going on right now. So let me start by doing the awkward, starting to share my screen. Let me put this in. Slideshow. Okay. So indeed, our topic is voter suppression and voter fraud. And for many people, those two terms are synonymous. That cries of voter fraud are false and that they're really voter suppression. And for other people, they think cries of voter suppression are really just justifications for voter fraud. So in many ways, depending on which part of the aisle you're on, you think one is false and one is true, but they are really the kind of mirrors of each other, which is what we'll talk about today. So I don't know if I can see the chat, but I want as many people as can first write into the chat. Does everyone have access to the chat, or just us?
No, there's no access to chat.
Okay, so everyone write down on something next to you, or note in your head, why can you vote, assuming that you can, or in other words, what empowers you to vote? Okay, and then we'll ask the same question at the end of the presentation, and you can think about if your thoughts have changed in any particular way, because really what all of this is about is why can we vote, and what's fair in terms of whether we can vote and what isn't. All right, so why can you vote? What empowers you to vote? Do we have any way for people to chat in answers? Probably not. For many of you, you probably answered the US Constitution. And many people think that their right to vote resides in the US Constitution. And in most constitutional democracies, it does. And we hear lots of stories in American history about our constitutional right to vote, our inalienable right to vote, when Black men got the right to vote, when women were guaranteed the right to vote. And in fact, what's been the greatest surprise to many of the audience I've talked with over the last couple of years is that we're highly unusual as a constitutional democracy. We do not enshrine a right to vote in our Constitution. We didn't at the founding, and we still don't. And that's going to be really what our story is about today. So there is no right to vote in the Constitution. And in fact, US citizens possess no right to vote. I know this is hard to imagine and hard to believe, but it is in fact true. And the Supreme Court has affirmed this over and over and over again in cases where people claim they're entitled to a right to vote. And the Supreme Court will say, no, it's not a right of citizens. It's not enshrined in the Constitution. It is in fact merely a privilege, and therefore can be abridged. And what we've argued about over the course of US history is on what grounds can it be abridged, right? What's legitimate abridgment? What's not legitimate abridgment? And that has changed over time. So if you answer the Constitution, you do not vote because you have a right to vote that resides in the Constitution. You vote according to state law. And that was true at the founding, and it's true now. Essentially, the states set whatever they want voting law to be. So the states create voters. And they are not obliged to create all people as voters, because there's nothing in the Constitution that says everyone has a right to vote. So the states essentially can set any kind of voter eligibility law that they want, or well, you could call that also voter disenfranchisement law, because you have to clear the eligibility criteria in order to vote. And if you can't clear the eligibility criteria, then you don't vote. And that battle over what is state voter eligibility criteria has been the ongoing battle of US history around voting access. And essentially what happens is that states set up restrictions, and then social activists go to the federal government and try to get the federal government to strike down those restrictions in the states. Okay, so that's kind of the story we're looking at today. And I call these really what's been won over the years. When we refer to this as a right to vote, I'm referring to this now in my work as a negative right to vote. And you'll see that, not a positive right to vote that we are invested with, that we possess, that cannot be abridged. American citizens unusually do not have that. We are one of the only constitutional democracies that does not contain such a right for citizens of the roughly 140 constitutional democracies across the globe. All right, so a really quick dive into history here. By the 1820s and 30s in the United States, at the beginning of the nation, all states set voting criteria very differently. In fact, women could vote in New Jersey if they had sufficient property. Black men could vote in various places. But by the 1820s and 30s in the United States, all states require that voters be, among other things, including residency, age, that they be white and male. Okay, and those two words have been the source of much contention at the state level. Nobody in this era, though, would have gone to a federal constitution to change voting rights. They would have gone to the state and said, I want you to eliminate the word white so that I can vote as a non-white person. Or if you were a suffragist, a white suffragist, you would have said, I want the word male eliminated so that I can vote. Or if you were a Black woman, you would want both eliminated. And that was how voting activism proceeded in the United States for 100 years. Then the Constitution entered the picture. And that happened with the American Civil War, but roughly 100 years after we were a nation. And the Civil War settles two things: that we are indeed a nation that will remain whole, and that chattel slavery has ended, at least officially. The question then becomes, what is the status of freed people? And that era of American history is known as Reconstruction. Freed people demand many things. It's a very ugly battle with lots and lots of vigilante violence. But one of the things that Congress decides to do is pass a constitutional amendment to enfranchise Black men. And this is the first time in 1869 that the Constitution has ever been used to leverage voting power of citizens. In fact, the debate in Congress was the first debate Congress had ever had about the voting rights of constituents. It was highly controversial. Many people considered it an abridgment of states' rights. But in 1870, the 15th Amendment, the last of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th and the 14th being the other two, were added to the US Constitution. And here's where I referred to a negative right to vote. We talk about the 15th Amendment as granting Black men the right to vote. It does no such thing. It does not grant Black men a right to vote. It does not even mention the word male. But what it says is the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what it says essentially, if we go back to this slide, is that the word white is no longer constitutional. States may not use the word white any longer. So what they really don't do is invest Black men with a right to vote. What they do is they regulate the states. And they say to the states, hey, cut it out with that word. But your prerogative to create whatever voter eligibility law you want stands, all right? And the reason Black women don't vote in the wake of this is because the word male is still on the books. And the second thing they do is say that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by legislation, which Congress does, and many, many Black men begin voting in this era. The next time that the Constitution will be used to leverage, by social movements to leverage voting access will be the 19th Amendment in 1920, which is exactly modeled on the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged. Again, it's negative language, not shall be guaranteed to, shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. So in other words, the word male is now struck. And Congress shall have the power to enforce this by appropriate legislation. So at this point, by 1920, into the 20th century, the states can ban voting on any grounds they see fit except two: race and sex. Those are the only two things they cannot deny voting on. And for a while, Congress enforces all of this. And then the 24th Amendment In 1964, says the right of citizens to vote in federal elections shall not be denied or abridged, again, not an affirmative right to vote, by reason of failure to pay a poll tax. Okay, so that ends poll taxes. And again, Congress has the power to enforce. And the fourth and final amendment in the US Constitution that regulates voting is the 26th Amendment, passed in 1971, ratified. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years and older shall not have their right to vote denied or abridged, right, because of age. Those are the only four things that the Constitution says states may not do in their otherwise limitless prerogative and power to set voter eligibility law. That's it. That's all the Constitution does. It does not guarantee anyone a right to vote. It just says on those four things, if we kind of summarize them here, you are not allowed to, states are not allowed to discriminate on those grounds. They can discriminate on other grounds. Okay. Now, if we keep moving, it's the 15th Amendment really that has been a kind of ongoing thorn in the side of many white Americans. Really, the other three have not been rounded, payment of poll taxes a little bit, but sex and over 18 really have never been significantly challenged. But the 15th continues to be a debated and contested piece of American democracy, partly because many people argue people are trying to keep American democracy white. And that's a question you can ask for yourself as we move through this presentation. Does that seem plausible to you? After the 15th Amendment, and this is important to know, Black men begin voting across the South in massive numbers where most resided, also in northern states. 80 to 90% voter participation. And in fact, they elect the first Black members of the US Congress in 1870 and 1871 that go to the US Congress. But then there is much voter intimidation, much vigilante violence trying to keep African-American men from the polls across the United States. But yet it is a experiment that Congress defends with troops, with other things, not always robustly, but Congress is saying we want this enforced. Until finally in the 1880s, the US Congress and the United States, which has the power to enforce that article, that amendment, says basically we don't care anymore, we're going to turn our back. And as the white supremacist governments that overthrow the biracial democracies of the South take office in 1890, they start creating Jim Crow voting laws. So what they do is they say, okay, the North doesn't care. We just have to abide by the 15th Amendment in spirit, or, in letter of law, but not in spirit. So what they do is they say, well, we'll just create a different voter obstacle and we'll use it to ensnare African-American voters. So they pass a poll tax, they pass a literacy test. And these were often designed to racially target people. Like the literacy test might not be assigned to a white person who came in, but would be administered to an African-American person. And they were often very fraudulently administered. There's a woman in the wake of 1920, for example, an African-American woman in Virginia who goes to take the literacy test knowing she can pass it. She's handed a blank piece of paper and she's told she fails. And in many states, by the 1960s in Mississippi, a famous example, it becomes required in your literacy test to say how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap. And this leads voting of African Americans across the nation, but most residing in the South still at this point, to go from 80 to 90% to 10 to 2%. Meanwhile, women's suffrage is making gains because all these states, which control their voter law, start striking the word woman. At the same time that this is happening, the word male is being struck from state voter law out west. So what I want to point out here is that our story of American democracy has never been one of steady opening. It is always one of cross currents, of gains for some and efforts to push back. So while this effort to push back is going on, many states are dropping the word male voluntarily in advance of well, not voluntarily, but under social pressure in advance of the 19th Amendment. And it is because of these laws that Congress finally passes the 19th Amendment, because they know they're only enfranchising white women, because Black women will now get ensnared in these laws that they've just created to formally disenfranchise Black men. And so when the 19th Amendment passes in 1920, and it says giving women, the entire nation vote this fall, and we still hear that today, guaranteed women the right to vote. We just had a big anniversary for this amendment, and you heard all kinds of triumphant language like this. In fact, not all women could vote. Millions could. Millions voted before 1920. Millions voted because of 1920, and millions still didn't vote after 1920. And that's because they were ensnared in these new state laws of poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses. These kinds of things were ensnaring many, many people, not on grounds of sex, which is the only thing the 19th Amendment regulated, but it didn't invest women with a right to vote. That has still never been achieved by social movements in the United States. So there were other people who couldn't vote because they weren't allowed to be citizens, right? We had racially driven citizenship laws. This was true we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had Indigenous Americans who always had very conflicting. So I don't want to make it sound like it's only state law. There's also citizenship laws that have disenfranchised people. But then in 1965, with the signing of the Voting Rights Act, most African Americans, men have their voting rights restored to them, and African American women, if they lived in a disenfranchising state, get the right to vote finally, as we call it, or I say get voting access, because I think that's more accurate. I think we mislead ourselves when we talk about voting rights in the United States. We never interrogate what it actually is. The signing of the Voting Rights Act was one of the most effective pieces of legislation ever passed by the US Congress, and it was the crowning kind of final major legislative piece of the civil rights movement of the 60s. And it did a couple of things. It said to the South, you may not use literacy tests. We are going to send in registrars and start registering people to vote. We are going to deputize African Americans and train them to register people to vote, getting rid of the all-white registrars who could bar people when they came in. And voting rates in the South go from, among African Americans, from 2 to 3% back up to 65 to 85% almost overnight. African Americans start voting in massive numbers. And that's true around the country, because it wasn't only the South that used these laws. It was actually much of the North and the West as well, to disenfranchise Latinos, to disenfranchise immigrants, all kinds of people. The other significant thing for our talk today is that the Voting Rights Act also did another important thing. It restored congressional interest in enforcing the 15th Amendment. In many ways, the signing of the Voting Rights Act is quite triumphant and seems like a story, a part of the opening of American democracy. It seems really depressing if you think of it as, finally, 100 years later, Congress says, okay, after much pressure, 100 years of activism by African Americans, okay, fine, we'll go back down and enforce the 15th Amendment. Not even back down south. I mean, the 15th Amendment was being violated in New York. It was being violated all over. So in many ways, the signing of the Voting Rights Act is 100 years later, Congress finally saying, okay, fine, you want me to enforce the 15th Amendment? I will. We will. And what they do is they create an office inside the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Office, that enforces the Voting Rights Act. And what they do is they put certain districts, states or areas that have a long history of racial discrimination, not other types of discrimination, but racial discrimination, under what's called preclearance, which is essentially federal oversight. So it reverses the state-federal role. And it says, if you're going to pass a law, state, and you have a history of racial discrimination, you got to bring it to the feds first. You got to bring it to the Department of Justice. We'll vet it and see whether or not it's discriminatory, whether or not it's racially biased. If it's not, you can enact it. If it is, we're going to strike it down and prevent you from enacting it. And the DOJ over these years struck down thousands and thousands of racially discriminatory laws. And it's really only in the wake of the signing of the Voting Rights Act and congressional enforcement against state voter discrimination that we have become a fully fledged democracy in the United States. Really, since 1965 was really the first time we were a fully functioning democracy in the United States. But then circa 2011, many state legislatures, and largely Republican, that's just objective, started arguing that there was voter fraud going on. And remember, state legislatures are still the ones that have the power to pass voting law. You vote according to state law. You do not vote according to federal law. So they started arguing for voter fraud, that there was charges of voter fraud and that they ought to be enforcing they ought to create new laws that would prevent voter fraud, that would protect democracy. And they had trouble doing that. Texas, for example, passed a voter ID law, and they were under preclearance. So they had to submit it to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice said, I'm sorry, this is patently racially discriminatory. We could talk about how that was later. You may not enact this law. So again, the Voting Rights Act was working to keep racial discrimination in check in the states that were trying to enact racially discriminatory laws, until those state efforts got a huge boost in 2013 with a Supreme Court decision called Shelby County v. Holder. This would have been Eric Holder, the Attorney General, Shelby County, Alabama, who was under preclearance, right? Couldn't enact their own laws without Department of Justice oversight, voting law. And in the Supreme Court decision, they decide that, in fact, Chief Justice John Roberts will write the decision. And Chief Justice John Roberts' job as a young, newly minted lawyer in the 1980s Reagan DOJ was to kill the 1982 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. That was his job. And he failed. But then he wrote the majority decision that did gut the Voting Rights Act. And what Shelby County v. Holder did is take away preclearance, essentially. It said, racial discrimination is a thing of the past. These formulas are very old. They don't apply to today. And basically the ability of the DOJ to strike down laws in advance of their enactment was lost after 2013. And what we've seen since then, and there were many, many people out protesting, which is what you see down in the right corner, what you've seen since then is the rapid enactment of state voter laws. And again, some people argue they're being enacted because they're protecting voting, and other people argue, no, this is merely voter suppression. But again, the states are still largely empowered to do this. They just can't do it still on a kind of limited number of things that either the Constitution or the federal government has said you can't do. So we have all these new federal laws, and this started well before the Trump moment. Okay, this started in 2013. Post Shelby County v. Holder. And again, the question is voter fraud or voter suppression, right? And I'm going to present an argument today that this is voter suppression and not voter fraud, but this is a decision you'll have to make for yourself because we're having that argument as a country. And so even in 2016, for example, before Donald Trump won, right? Ari Berman here, who I think is a wonderful reporter who works on voting rights, thought that the most undercovered story of 2016 was the GOP attack on voting rights, right? These state laws that were rolling back voting access. So what I'm trying to say is this is not a Trump created thing. It's been a Trump amplified thing. And by 2016, before the 2016 presidential election was decided, the Democracy Index, which is the Economist's nonpartisan institute that gauges the health of democracies around the globe, downgraded American democracy from a fully functioning democracy to a flawed democracy. And that was before the 2016 election, precisely because of all these state voter restrictions that were really, really strongly cutting into people's ability to access the ballot box. Then came Trump. Okay, he wins in 2016. And you may remember that even in 2016, if we go back in time, Donald Trump claimed that he actually won the popular vote because according to the vote tolls, he had not won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. And he argued that there were millions upon millions of Latinos in California who had to cast fraudulent ballots and robbed him of the election. And he appointed a commission headed by Mike Pence and also Chris Kobach, who had initiated a lot of voter suppression laws in Kansas to study, all of the fraud and the, the breakdowns and the fraudulent practices of the 2016 election. That commission could not find any evidence and disbanded in 2017 without ever issuing a report. So all I'm saying is that, again, none of this is new. It's just been amplified. It's estimated that Donald Trump tweeted several times a day over his presidency, or the average was not estimated. It's actually been proven several times a day about voter fraud during his. So it was a constant throughout his presidency. And many people argued by the time we got to 2016, he wasn't really even running against Biden. He was running against American democracy itself. Let's look at some of these new state voter laws, okay? Because again, they are part of a broader Republican state voter effort, but you may think they're just, you may think they're not. But here's how they've been working out. Voter ID laws, for example. Now let's talk about, I'm only going to talk about a couple of the different kinds of laws that are passing, and we have tons of those kinds of laws passing right now. or different kinds of laws passing right now. Many people argue, well, it should be reasonable that you shouldn't impersonate someone at the polls, right? You shouldn't be able to just walk up and vote. And sure enough, voter ID laws are perfectly reasonable laws and can be constructed in ways that are protective of American democracy. But I would recommend to you this book over here, Carol Anderson, One Person, No Vote. She has a chapter on all of these different methods that I'm going to lay out today, or not all of them, but many of them. And she has just a chapter on voter ID laws. And she explains that, yes, voter ID laws can be very good and good safeguards for American democracy, but the voter ID laws crafted in states around the country have been done with laser precision to try to disenfranchise voters of color. And disenfranchise young people who tend to vote Democratic. So you cannot use, for example, a student ID from the University of Austin, which is a government, ID in so many ways, but you can use your gun permit or your National Rifles Association card to vote, for example. So it's how the voter ID law is created, okay? And many people argue these voter ID laws are not valid because they've been created in ways that are so restrictive. And it turns out the incidence of in-person voter fraud is minuscule. It does happen, but it's let me see if I can get the zeros right, 0.000002. That's the fraction of the percent that in-person voter fraud represents. So it does happen, but many people argue the outsized loss of voting access for millions upon millions of Americans is not commensurate with a tiny amount that can't sway elections, whereas the disenfranchisement caused by these voter ID laws, which are very underhandedly created, does sway elections. So here's just an example. Native Americans in North Dakota, for example, living on reservations, do not have postal addresses. What they have is a post office box. And that's because of two things. Many reservations, many native lands, do not assign street names and numbers to your house. It's not a cultural practice or a way that they would map space. And many of the US postal offices will not deliver to your door. These are vast, rambling things, often with, roads of various states. And the US Postal Service will only deliver to your post office box. So for many, many people, their IDs have their post office box on them. And when you go to register to vote, that is called a false ID because it doesn't have a legitimate address on it. So Native Americans said, basically, the federal government gave us this address. Now they're telling us we can't use that address to register to vote, that it's a false, address. We're faking our address. And so they sued, and the courts actually upheld this and said, that seems perfectly reasonable. You shouldn't have a post office box. And they're like, but that's the address the government gave us. So here's an example of how voter ID laws can work in ways that seem, and so, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Native Americans could not vote in the election because they had post office boxes, and the federal government said that's an invalid address. Your ID is not valid then. Another way is closing early voting or closing Sunday voting, which is what North Carolina did in connection with a voter ID law. And then because it couldn't be stopped in advance by preclearance, people had to then sue and say this violates the Voting Rights Act, but it went into effect while it was being tested in court. And, the court process is a long, winding, expensive process. And eventually the opponents of that law won because it was a voter ID law and shutting down early voting for African Americans who often had these power to the polls events on Sundays at church. You would sort of get people to go and do Sunday voting. And in the documents that North Carolina submitted to court, they said they struck down Sunday voting because it advantaged African Americans to get to the polls. So they themselves incriminated themselves. And the circuit court ruled that this law was so carefully crafted that it targeted Black voters, they said, with surgical precision. So what I'm saying is these laws sound plausible, but if you look at their details, they are highly devious. And they have been found over and over again to be suppressive of many voters, but disproportionately voters of color. Partisan gerrymandering is going on right now in really massive numbers. Is going to be a really big issue for the next coming year and our year here. So partisan gerrymandering, and this is the last one I'll go through, and then we'll jump forward. But there's so many ways. Partisan gerrymandering works basically like this. Whoever the party is in power in state legislatures, and many state legislatures, not all, but many, draw the districts. Okay, how many people. And they base that on the census, which happens every 10 years. And so in 2011, many Republican state legislatures drew districts that heavily favored Republicans. And this will happen again now in 2021 based on the 2020 census. And this has long-lasting effects. And here's what happened, for example, in Wisconsin. And let me show you what gerrymandering looks like. So if a state has, or if the state has, it's unfortunate this is red and blue, but 60% blue and 40% red, this you would think would be fair distribution. There's lots to discuss about that, but right, blue would get 3 and red would get 2 seats, if we want to kind of say, like across here. There's another way you could do this, which is draw it this way, right? And then you've got this is the perfect one. Then you could do this if you wanted, where blue gerrymanders. In other words, blue gives itself an unfair advantage based on the total numbers. It draws it in such a way that it can win every single district, and red never has a chance of winning a representative. So, all the Republicans here can vote for the Republican candidate, but if blue turns out, they'll always be swamped. And the other way is this way, where red can actually partisan gerrymander, even though they're a minority. They could draw it this way, and they could win 3 districts, whereas blue could only win 2. But blue, nonetheless, has the majority of, voters. So that's partisan gerrymandering, right? Drawing districts in any of these ways that are not really representing the will of the people. And then in other words, one person, one vote doesn't work in this case. That is currently happening in many, many, many states. This is what's happening right here. And so Wisconsin is a perfectly fine example. In Wisconsin, right now, it is so partisan gerrymandered that Democrats are winning 60 to 65% of the vote, and they're getting 30 to 35% of the seats. So again, one person, one vote can, so how we count whether our vote counts is highly important. So I'm going to jet through. There are other examples of the kinds of laws that are taking place: closing polling places, long lines, not equipping and closing polling locations, which shuts down access and ability to vote. Purging voter rolls. It was estimated between 2016 and 2018 that 16 million voters were removed from the rolls, many of them active eligible voters. And disenfranchisement of the formerly incarcerated, which is an epidemic problem in the United States because our incarceration problem in the United States, and particularly among people of color, has gotten so bad. There are only 2 states in the country that allow the formerly incarcerated to vote, the 2 right here. All others. And this is the way the incarceration rate has moved in the United States. So it's gone, from, we are now the largest jailer in the world, more than China, more than Russia. And that is not per capita. That is just by sheer numbers, even though those. So if you want to know more about that, I recommend you read these 2 books. And because of because of felon disenfranchisement or formerly incarcerated disenfranchisement, which is disproportionately, here's a map, right? Those are the biggest jailers in the world. We're the biggest, but we have far fewer people than China, is overwhelmingly people of color, right? So that is overwhelmingly disproportionately affecting the voting rights of people of color who are losing them because of mass incarceration. Again, we as a nation do not rate well right now, but it is not because of voter fraud. It is because of voter suppression, according to, things. So the question is why? So let's take a look at this question. I'll just finish up here in the next couple of minutes. Is there voter fraud? Is there corruption? Is there a failed system? Now, this question seems to be getting a lot of steam regardless of evidence. And again and again and again, the evidence shows that fraud and corruption do happen. But where they're able to affect elections tends to be on a very small scale, where you can actually manipulate the means of the election. On a national scale, voter fraud and voter corruption occur at less than 0.5%. Does occur, but not enough to sway elections. Whereas the amount of people being disenfranchised since the failing of the Voting Rights Act absolutely is swaying elections and the kind of practices and things like that. And there are, reports out there from the Heritage Foundation and others that claim that, of I think 1,100 cases that they found, 749, were voter fraud. But those are based on since the 1870s. So again, it's not there's just not evidence. And in 2012, for example, there were only 10 incidents of impersonation of voter fraud, and 118 million votes were cast, and 10 incidents of voter impersonation fraud. And the NAACP again said electoral fraud is occurring at in-person electoral fraud at a rate of I had one too many zeros in my number I gave you. Tiny amounts. And it seems that when GOP, for example, Trump said live on Fox and Friends that the GOP is hurt when it's easier to vote. And this is what many people argue is actually what's driving voter fraud, and particularly how it's disproportionately affecting people of color. And that is demographics. Many people on the side of voter suppression would argue it's demographics that's causing voter suppression. There is no evidence for voter fraud, which again, the courts found over and over again in Trump's big lie about the election, which seems to be designed to derail American democracy. And this is basically what's happening with American demographics. So here's 10 years ago. Or no, excuse me. I forget why I draw these two lines. Oh, this would be the, so here's the white population, very aged, very old. And here is sort of young people. And so if you, Obama had a tremendous get out the vote campaign. And right now the demographics in the United States are changing. Minority babies, if you want to call it that, are no longer majority. They are the majority, are no longer the minority. They are now the majority of the nation's infants. And if you look at the voting of minorities, they all tend to vote overwhelmingly Democratic. So basically, these demography shifts, along with what that means for the Republican Party, mean essentially suicide. That they are not going to have enough voters to keep the party afloat because the party is overwhelmingly white, as you can see here. And Asian Americans have started voting overwhelmingly Democratic. And so, very, very soon, there's going to be a minority white population and the Republicans will have trouble getting votes. And so many people argue, and Obama did an amazing job of getting out that vote, getting those people who, often didn't vote involved in the electoral process. And many people argue that that's what's driving voter suppression, right? An attempt to keep the Republican Party, a white party, alive against an increasingly diverse and increasingly, very demographic in the United States. So here's where we are now. This was the Brennan Center for Justice has a great website if you want to go there and kind of explore all the different voter fraud reports. They do analyses of them. But these are the states right now with restrictive voting bills that are in play. There are over 300 proposed right now. But what I hope you can see then is the question is, states still control voting. That has never changed. None of the voting social activism of Americans has ever created a right to vote that can't be abridged. We do not possess that as citizens of the United States. Nor has it taken away from the states the ability to erect new and inventive criteria to disenfranchise people, which is what states have done over and over again in American history. And social activists are right now trying to leverage with the federal government, and the federal government is trying to rein in the states with the For the People Act and the restoration of the Voting Rights Act, of preclearance with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And this is all before Congress right now. The For the People Act would mean that the states can't start taking away your right to vote for federal elections, and they are being resoundingly opposed by Republicans and resoundingly supported by Democrats. So I'm going to end there, and I would ask you again to ask yourself then, why can you vote? What empowers you to vote? And really, you don't have a right to vote what you have is an ability to either clear or not clear state criteria. And those state criteria are erected in ways that we argue about what's fair, right? What's the right way to, to erect those state criteria. So that's, sorry, I went on long, but I feel passionate about this. And because it's so present right now, it seemed worth going into the kind of longer history. So what we get is social movements saying, stop discriminating, and then states coming up with new ways to discriminate, and almost always along lines of race. So I'll stop there.
Let me thank you both. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion historically, in the present, about the future as well. And this concludes the Dietrich Deep Dives program for the spring. We will be doing another one next year. And so if any of you have any ideas for topics you'd like to see, email to us and we will see what we can do. But let me give my immense thanks to Lisa and Kareem for an absolutely fantastic session that was incredibly provocative. And thank you all for coming. And closing these things is, as they say, much more abrupt than usual. We can't just hang around and talk about what's happened in the hallway. When the Zoom session gets shut down, all of a sudden we're all gone. So that's what it's going to feel like. Lisa's at the beach. She can go out and look at the waves, and she'll be maybe happy about this. But thank you again, both of you, and thank you all for coming. And
Likewise. Thanks so much.
enjoy the rest of the day or the evening, whatever is left of it.